My name's Ken O'Donnell. I work in the California State University System Office. This is a recording of a presentation that I made in mid-November to the Virginia Assessment Group. At the end of this recording, I'll have a link to a blog that I keep so that if you're watching and you have questions you want to ask me or other reasons to get in touch, you'll have a way to. The point that I was making to that group is one that may also seem relevant to people who aren't involved directly just in assessment. And it has to do with the way we're counting on reliable, valid measures of student learning to help bail us out of some of the problems facing higher education, keeping us from helping our students as much as we want to. And the first of the three that I'm going to share with has to do with money. The way we fund in the publics has been changing a lot before our very eyes, so that in the last 25 years you see a declining share of support from the public and a rising burden on the students themselves, who are asked to front what's closing in on 50% of the cost of instruction. When they cross that line, it'll mean that our so-called public institutions are really more private than public. And that declining support has led to the protests that we've seen in recent years around the country, where students asked to bear a greater and greater share of the cost really can't do it, and yet they still want access to the higher education that we offer. That's truest for those of us who work in the publics, but it's just as applicable really when you talk about funding problems to students who are enrolled in private universities, because as you know, the private aren't really private. Federal financial aid means that taxpayers are footing the bill for a lot of that education as well. And there's growing concern about the indebtedness that our students leave all our institutions with, whether public or private. And so I'll categorize that as increasing debt for all students. A third symptom of the financial woes that afflict us is what I'll structural deficits. This is recognition of our aging infrastructure. A lot of our institutions were built in the middle of the 20th century. And as a result, we have a lot of our money going to things other than education and related expenses. Things like the physical plant, maintenance, service on the debt, pension and health obligations for our employees. That's not a ratio that you want. It puts us in the company of other enterprises that are not doing very well and leads to headlines like this one. Underlying all three of those issues around money, the fact that publics are less public, that all students are more in debt, and that we have an awful lot of overhead to pay, underlying all of that and exacerbating it is a failure in higher education to communicate exactly what it is that people get for their money. This has been pointed out by a number of observers, I think most visibly by these two guys. Their book, The Innovative University, draws an analogy that I found helpful about how bundling and unbundling contributes to disruption in an economic sector. Look at a disconnect between the source of the revenue and the actual underlying value of what's being sold. With a couple of helpful examples. In network television, the revenue traditionally came from selling time on TV commercials, whereas the value, the reason anyone turned on a TV set, was not the commercials but the programs. So when a means comes along to separate those two, to let people fast forward over the commercials, for example, the whole business model is threatened. In the same way, traditional newspapers got their revenue from classified and paid advertising, but that's not why people bought a paper. They went to the newspaper because they wanted to know what was going on in the world. And so as soon as someone came along who could unbundle that, who could, for example, with Craigslist, offer a means of publishing free classified ads, the whole business model was threatened. Higher ed is vulnerable to the same incursions. We realize our revenue from instruction, standard credit hours, lectures, but that's not why people come to us. They come to us for the learning. And when means come along to separate those two, like putting free lectures on YouTube or hosting a MOOC, observers think, correctly, that our business model is threatened. Those of us who don't see that as a threat, who believe that higher education was always offering something other than listening to lectures, now have a new and urgent reason to explain exactly what that something else is. And that comes down, I'll argue, to learning outcomes assessment and helping us solve our problem that the money doesn't follow what matters. Second problem I'm going to share with you has student success. That is, we don't have much of it. I'm going to air some dirty laundry with you. This is from the California State University. Our 6-year graduate rates for all students was at 46% recently, and for students of color, the number was even worse. Moving to our California community colleges, there's more dirty laundry to share. This is the 6-year transfer rate among degree seekers. So even though the community colleges serve students with a variety of aspirations and intentions, when you look only at the ones who say they want to transfer, and then you come back to them and look 6 years later at how many of them actually did it, you see that not many managed it, and that there's a nearly 10-point penalty for students of color. We want to do better than that. And in a sense, we need to do so together because so many of our students transfer. And in fact, they not only transfer, but they follow the same curriculum in the lower division. And that's done in California by a trick devised about 40 years ago called general education certification. What it does is let students at the community colleges take courses that are guaranteed to apply to the baccalaureate degree when they transfer to our universities. We do it by taking the traditional GE curriculum and dividing it into content areas that are probably familiar to you from when you were in college, and assigning to each content area an alphanumeric code. The student can look up a community college online, see the same alphanumeric codes listed next to the courses, and know that that course will help contribute to a bachelor's degree after transfer. After transfer, here in the CSU, we require an additional 9 units of upper division GE that goes together with the 39 from the sending college where the student came to us from. But even that sending college probably didn't offer all 39 units. More likely, it was cobbled together from additional prior learning, either at other community colleges, at 4 years in-state, out-of-state, maybe training in the military, maybe standardized tests like CLEP, International Baccalaureate, or AP. It's a good system in many ways. It's efficient and frugal and a win for access and portability. But it also leaves on the table some unique strengths of general education, really things that only GE can do. First among those is that GE is the welcome mat. It's the thing that tells people they're in college, that it's rigorous, that it's different. We want the students who come to us, nervous, scared, first generation, to be impressed by the rigor, the depth, the practical value of the things that we're teaching them. Second, GE by definition reaches all students. So if there's something in higher education that we know works, for example, peer mentoring or learning communities, then it belongs in this part of the curriculum so that everybody gets it. In other words, it has reach. And then finally, if we're talking about what's good in GE, it's worth pointing out that this is decent curriculum. If you ask students why they come to us, they say it's to get a job. If you ask employers what they want, they say it's the kind of skills that come with GE. And so we should be leading with arguments for our students that say this is the site of the skills of broad employability that motivated you to come to college in the first place. If you think about it, there's a pretty sobering difference between the GE we want and the GE we have. We want GE that takes advantage of its hook value, of its reach, and of the skills for broadly based, flexible employability. What we have is the checklist and the assembly line. A little bit with that in mind, a few years ago, the faculty committee at CSU that I work with the most closely, our GE advisory group, did a rewrite of our executive order on general education and breadth, singling out in particular Article 3 premises, where it cites the Liberal Education and America's Promise campaign and the essential learning outcomes. You may be 4 of them paraphrased in our executive order. They come down to content knowledge, intellectual skills, responsibility, and integrative learning, all toward living up to what we want our GE to deliver for our students. If you think about it, each of these 4 ways of thinking about liberal learning should be measurable. We should be able to say, when you get to a certain point, you're ready for transfer from a community college to a CSU. And our students should be able to see their proficiency emerging along these different axes so that they know when they're ready to transfer. That forward-thinking, goal-oriented approach to transfer curriculum as an alternative to the inputs model is likely to be more motivating and a better win for student success, beating our woeful numbers not just in the CSU for 6-year graduation rates, but also in the community colleges with their success. So the second main problem that I'll say we need assessment to help us solve, first it was the money, it's also the student engagement. That the inputs model, the one that we all inherited, loses our students by failing to highlight the relevance and value of what they're learning with us. I'm going to stop for a moment and ask you to think what the world is that they're entering. And I'll begin with some commonplaces. Information is everywhere. They'll have a lot of different careers. And as a consequence of those first 2 points, they're going to need to keep learning on their own after they're done with us. And that learning will be more connected, more interdisciplinary than it needed to be before. This is George Siemens. He writes a blog called Connectivism, and he puts it this way. I find that pretty compelling, pretty persuasive. It's an idea echoed in a way by business consultant Franz Johansson. By Medici effect, he's talking about what drives creativity. Where can businesses find the sort of innovation that leads to real profitability, real long-term health and growth? And he says it comes down to looking for ways to have a collision of ways of thinking. And when he looks around the world at who hosts such innovation factories, who does he see but us, universities? This is Leon Cooper, one of the examples that Johansson cites. At Columbia University, Cooper runs the brain science program. And look at the list of disciplines that it hosts. This is what Johansson says you have to do if you want to be an idea factory. But he also says it's not a game for the patient. Here's how he puts it. So, pretty good. And a reflection, I think, of changes in the kinds of learning that all of our institutions need to be making. The college that I went to, or of our parents' generation, our grandparents, mostly emphasized content knowledge as the reward for college learning. They would also single out, although with a little bit less emphasis, intellectual skills like quantitative reasoning, verbal fluency. So up there, but secondary. And then way at the bottom, dispositional skills, the ability to work in teams, to share a common goal, to get along, kind of as a form of finishing school almost. But what we're seeing since then, as the world gets more connected, as problems become more complicated, there's a new premium on really all those kinds of learning so that they're in more balance with each other, and there's less of a hegemony of knowledge, content knowledge. Not that it's dead, it's just not king anymore. I'm going to support that assertion by citing some labor experts, but before I do, a disclaimer. This emphasis that I have on employability and work is a concession to what our students want, what our public wants. It was a little disingenuous generations ago when we would tell people come to college for the full life of the mind, and really we were preparing them for something altogether different. The fact is, these days that's not so different. That as work becomes more personal, more cultural, more human, that full life of the mind is precisely what leads to employability. So even though I'm emphasizing employability, I don't want to suggest that it's the only benefit to going to college. There are plenty of other benefits, but they go together. So we might as well speak in language that our public is listening for. First of the experts that I'll cite, this is Richard Greenwald. He's a labor historian at Drew University. His books cover the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire all the way up to Containerization, the World in a Box. That picture down there is out my window at the port of Long Beach, just south of Los Angeles. And in those boxes, in that globalized shipping and trade, is the fact that our students are competing more than ever with people all over the world. You can't get a premium on your labor anymore just for being born on a lucky continent. Here's how he puts it. I find that very convincing, and it echoes points made by Daniel Pink. This is a psychologist and business consultant. If you've heard his name before, you might be thinking of a book called Drive, which was a bestseller a couple of years ago. This is the one right before that, called A Whole New Mind, where he makes a similar point that Greenwald does about changes in the nature of work. So given automation and outsourcing and exporting, what is today's worker to do for the sake of job security? How do you hold on to this stuff? Well, here's Pink's list. In other words, you have to be able to invest your work with significance. You have to make it look fun. You have to understand other people. 10 or 20 years ago, I would have said this is the list of what you need for a job in the entertainment business. More recently, I would say this list is evidence that the arts and humanities are really not down for the count, but just need to do a better job of explaining that this is where you can pick up a lot of this skill set. The other way to look at it is this is a list of things a robot can't do. My third labor expert, former boss, Charlie Reed, he would hold these meetings up and down the state with the people who employ our graduates. And like a lot of regional comprehensives, that's a range of businesses. There's the list that he was using. Tireless guy, worked really hard to meet with each of them one by one and ask, how are we doing? What can we do better? What are you seeing in our students? But what he found was that he could have held one meeting because they all gave him essentially the same answer. And this was their wish list. I look at that and I see a GE curriculum, but you could also look at that and say, that's dispositional learning, that's a skill set, that's the content knowledge, in roughly equal balance. And illuminating that is something we have not been very good at with learning. So the third main problem that I'm going to share with you as worth working on is that the current assessment doesn't capture a lot of the learning that is increasingly relevant and valuable for our students. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about high impact practices, which was really what the Virginia Assessment Group had invited me to talk to about because of a book that I contributed to earlier this year about how we're bringing high impact practices to scale in California. And those practices are service learning, peer mentoring, really almost anything that's experiential out of the classroom. Internships are another example, so is collaboration with faculty on its research. And what you can see is that this has benefits for student persistence and success. This is a study out of Cal State Northridge, one of our largest campuses, about an hour north of Los Angeles. The director of institutional research there was looking at Latino versus not Latino students and the 6-year graduation rate, which was not very good. That's 38 and 55 points, on par with the numbers that I shared with you earlier, and a gap of about 17 points. Then she looked at the results on the National Survey of Student Engagement, the NSSE, to see who had reported participating in one high-impact practice, so maybe one internship or one civic engagement experience. And that's the grad rates she saw. Measurably better, with a narrower gap, goes from 17 to 14 points. Then controlling for other predictors of success, like eligibility for federal financial aid, or ethnicity, or parents' educational attainment, or high school academic records. She looked at students reported participating in 2, and that's what she saw. Pretty great, and the gap is down to 3 points. And note that this is all stuff we already do. Most of our campuses have undergraduate research, learning communities. All of them have service learning. So this isn't about adding expense or cost centers to the enterprise so much as making the best of what we do more pervasive. I've shared this chart many times. Some of you watching this recording may have seen me do it before. I find it powerful. I think it's always worth putting in front of people. And yet, you may have noticed it's about 3 years old now. And so it's worth asking, why aren't we doing more with it? If we know this, why isn't it reflected in policy? In other words, if it's true, shouldn't we build it into the way we compensate faculty? Teaching this way is harder. It's more valuable. It should be paid more. Same thing with the way we allocate our physical plant, or for that matter, what we require of students to earn a degree. And I think there are a few reasons we haven't done that. Why this really promising data hasn't led to any action yet. One that might have already occurred to you is selection bias. You just never know with a chart like this whether the people opting in to these high impact practices are such go-getters that they would have graduated anyway. It's possible. I think when you control for those other predictors, you weed out some of that problem, but really the only answer is keep looking. See if you can spot the pattern so many times that you can start to believe in cause and effect. We're not there yet. There's another 2 problems, though, that I think we can start addressing right away. This was the subject of the book that I wrote for the AAC&U, and it's also current work in the CSU. So even by the time you're listening to this, the picture may have changed a little bit. I'm sharing with you where it is as of today. One of those 2 problems that we're solving right now has to do with the fact that it's all self-reported on that National Survey of Student Engagement. If you think about it, you're asking a college senior to think back and say whether or not he or she ever participated in a learning community, for example. Well, the student may not remember, and the university may not offer it under that name. So that's one serious issue. The other is that there's no recognized, universally understood definition of learning community that informs the response. So in the CSU, we're doing a few things to deal with both of these problems that have to do with our push on big data for student success. And to illustrate where the work is, I'm first going to share with you a simple diagram that our IT enterprise captures information in a variety of ways, then stores it, relates records to each other, and then displays it for decision makers. And at each of those 3 steps, there is work continuing on this front. On the capture side, the people who do our data entry are all over the place, right? Students do it when they apply for admission. Faculty and chairs do it when they write a class schedule or record student grades. And then there's the S4 tool that I'll describe in a moment. All of those different inputs can get related to each other in a data warehouse and then recombined for displays like the emerging Student Success Data Dashboard in the CSU, so that decision makers can see what's helping and what's hurting. The S4 component is a particularly intriguing one. It was developed on one of our campuses, the one at Monterey Bay, to keep records of student participation in service learning experiences off campus. And what we realized as they were developing this tool was that we could use it to shore up the evidence of the efficacy of some high-impact practices. At the same time, the Chancellor's Office made an allocation of a little over $7 million to a bunch of our campuses to embark on high-impact practices, and they came with a data requirement where we expect use of tools, either S4 itself or something like it, to help us keep better track of which students are participating in these things. And all in, that will help us beat this problem of only self-reported evidence. The other one is going to be, I think, even harder to solve, and that's that high-impact practices are too often in the eye of the beholder, that no 2 people mean the same thing when they describe them. For that, we took the recipients of that $7 the program directors on our various campuses, and we asked them this question. And then took all those people and convened a meeting at San Jose State University about a week after I first gave this presentation. Along with all those program point people, we brought in national experts from organizations that have been working on questions like this, and our IT people. And the object of the game was to derive stable, definitional elements that would be understood practically intuitively across our system. Not there is one true undergraduate research experience, for example. We really don't want to do that. There's diversity in these programs that responds to local need, local capacity. Instead, what we want is smaller elements of those definitions. For example, a checklist of maybe 3 or 4 items that would let the end user identify which of those 3 or 4 apply to the local program. And then we would have more meaningful data to run at the system level about the benefits of these various interventions. And then in the long run, and this is what gets back to learning outcomes assessment, we would want that case to be made not just for the sake of student persistence and closing equity gaps and long-term graduation rates, but really for learning. We think we could make a case that learning like this pays for itself, educational delivery like this pays for itself, not just in improved student success, but also in greater demonstrable proficiency in the kind of attributes that matter most for our graduates. So that's my list for people in assessment and elsewhere. Thanks for paying attention to this recording. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to close by leaving you a way to get in touch with me if you'd like to respond to anything that's here. And I look forward to hearing from you.